The first time Ezekiel Ashford saw Jane Conley, she was standing in the middle of a dust storm with a rifle in her hands, ready to shoot a man twice her size for trying to steal her cattle. And something about the way the wind whipped her skirts around her ankles, while she never once lowered that barrel, made him think he had never seen anything so magnificent in all his 31 years of walking this earth. It was the spring of 1878, in the high plains country of eastern Wyoming territory, where the grass grew tall enough to hide a man on horseback, and the winters could kill you faster than any bullet. Ezekiel had ridden into this stretch of land 3 days prior, following a trail that had gone cold on him more times than he cared to admit, searching for a herd of horses that had been stolen from his brother's ranch 2 counties over. He had not expected to find himself in the middle of a standoff between a young widow and a cattle rustler named Hollis Beck, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him through every saloon and trading post between here and the Nebraska line. "You point that thing away from me, girl," Hollis Beck was saying, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip, "before you do something you cannot take back. I have taken back plenty in my life, Mr. Beck," Jane Conley said, and her voice did not shake even a little, though Ezekiel could see from where he sat atop his horse that her hands trembled just slightly around the stock of the rifle. "I imagine I could take back a bullet from your hide same as anything else." Ezekiel had not meant to involve himself. He had learned long ago that other men's quarrels were rarely worth the trouble they brought, and a woman defending her own land against a thief was, in the strictest sense, none of his business. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, in the way she stood between Hollis Beck and a small huddle of cattle, as though she alone stood between the world and everything she had ever loved, that made him swing down from his horse and walk toward the both of them with his hand resting easy near his own revolver. "Evening," Ezekiel said, tipping his hat first to Jane, then to Hollis Beck, though he gave the rustler considerably less warmth in the gesture. "Seems to me there is a disagreement here that might benefit from a third opinion." Hollis Beck's eyes narrowed at him. "This is none of your concern, stranger." "Perhaps not," Ezekiel said, "but I have got nothing pressing to do this afternoon, and I find myself curious how a man justifies taking cattle from a woman standing on her own land with a rifle pointed square at his chest. The standoff might have gone poorly, might have ended in gunfire and blood soaking into the prairie grass, had Hollis Beck's nerve not finally broken under the weight of 2 guns instead of 1. He spat into the dirt, cursed them both soundly, and rode off toward the western hills with 3 of his men trailing behind him, promising in a voice thick with venom that this was not the end of things between himself and the widow Conley. When the dust of his departure had settled, Jane Conley lowered her rifle at last and turned to face the stranger who had appeared like Providence itself in her hour of need. She was younger than Ezekiel had first supposed, perhaps 26 or 27 years of age, with dark hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat and eyes the color of good strong coffee, sharp and assessing as they took his measure. "I did not ask for your help," she said, though there was no real anger in it, only the wariness of a woman who had learned not to trust kindness at face value. "No, ma'am, you did not," Ezekiel agreed, "but it seemed you might have use for it all the same." "I have had use for a great many things these past years," Jane said, slinging the rifle over her shoulder with the ease of long practice, "and I have managed to get by without most of them. I do not need saving, Mr. Ashford, Ezekiel Ashford." "Mr. Ashford," she said, testing the name in her mouth as though deciding whether she liked the taste of it. "I have carried this land alone since I was 19 years old, and I intend to go right on carrying it. But I will grant you that Hollis Beck is a particular kind of trouble, and I am obliged for the extra gun this afternoon, even if I did not ask for it." There was something in the flat, matter-of-fact way she said those words, "I have carried this land alone since I was 19 asterisk," that struck Ezekiel harder than he expected. He had known loss himself, had buried a wife and an infant daughter to fever some 6 years past in Missouri before he had come west to outrun the grief of it, and he recognized in Jane Conley's voice the particular exhaustion of a person who had spent so long being strong that she no longer remembered what it felt like to set the weight down. "How many years is that, exactly?" he asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer would matter less to her than the simple, grinding fact of it. "8," she said. "8 years since my father passed and left me this ranch with more debt than sense, and 4 years since I buried my husband besides. 8 years of counting every season, every drought, every winter I was not sure we would make it through." "Then that is 8 years too many to carry alone," Ezekiel said, quiet and certain, "and I do not believe you ought to keep counting them." Jane looked at him then with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between suspicion and something softer, something that had not had cause to surface in a long while. "You have a strange way of talking, Mr. Ashford, for a man I met not 20 minutes ago." "I have a strange way of noticing things, ma'am," he replied. "And I noticed that a woman who has held a rustler at bay with nothing but a rifle and her own nerve for the better part of an afternoon has probably earned the right to stop counting how long she has done it alone." She did not answer him right away. Instead, she turned and looked out over the small herd of cattle grazing near the creek bed, the modest homestead with its weathered barn and sagging fence line visible in the distance, all of it hers, all of it hard-won and harder kept. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its earlier iron. "You are welcome to stay the night, Mr. Ashford, if you have a mind to. It is a long ride back to wherever you are headed, and Holly's Beck does not strike me as a man who forgives being made a fool of in front of a stranger. I would not want you caught out on the trail if he decides to double back." "I would be obliged," Ezekiel said, and found that he meant it more than the simple politeness of the words suggested. They walked together back toward the small ranch house, Jane leading her horse and Ezekiel leading his, the cattle following at a slow amble behind them, as though they too understood there was safety now, where before there had only been one woman and her rifle standing against the whole wide, indifferent prairie. The ranch house itself was small but sturdy, built of hewn logs with a stone chimney that Jane explained her father had built himself back in 1870, when he had first staked this claim along the banks of a creek that ran clear even in the driest months of summer. Inside, the single main room held a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed tucked into the corner behind a curtain, along with the accumulated evidence of 8 years of a woman managing alone. Tools mended and remended, a rifle clean to a shine, ledgers stacked with careful figures that spoke of every dollar earned and every dollar spent. "It is not much," Jane said, setting a pot of coffee on the stove, "but it has kept me fed and warm longer than I had any right to expect." "It is more than most men manage on their own," Ezekiel said, taking a seat at the table she gestured toward, "let alone a woman working it by herself." "I did not always work it by myself," Jane said, and there was a weight in the words that told him this was a story she did not tell often or easily. "My husband, Thomas, he came out here with me when I was 22. We married young, both of us, and he was a good man, gentle in ways my father never was, but he did not have the constitution for this kind of life. A fever took him 4 years back, same kind that took so many that winter, and after that it was just me and the cattle and whatever hands I could hire come branding season." "I am sorry for your loss," Ezekiel said, and meant it, though he did not press further, sensing that Jane Conley was not a woman who wanted pity offered up like a currency to be spent. "And you, Mr. Ashford," she said, turning the conversation back on him with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to deflecting sympathy before it could take root, "what brings a stranger through this particular stretch of nowhere?" Ezekiel told her then of his brother's stolen horses, of the trail he had followed for 3 days that had gone cold somewhere near the base of the hills to the west, of his own homestead some 60 miles east near the town of Cheyenne, where he had been trying, with mixed success, to build something like a life for himself after losing his wife Sarah and their daughter Ruth to the fever 6 years past. I do not talk about it often, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of it. But I suppose there is something about sitting across from a woman who has buried her own losses that makes a man less inclined to keep his own locked up tight. Jane studied him for a long moment across the small table, the coffee steaming between them, the last light of the afternoon slanting golden through the single window. "Grief makes strange company of strangers," she said finally. "But I do not mind the company tonight, Mr. Ashford. It has been some time since I had reason to talk to anyone who was not asking me for something." They talked long into the evening, long after the sun had set and the stars had come out thick and bright over the Wyoming prairie, the way they only could in a place with no city lights to dim them. Jane told him of her father, a hard man but a fair one, who had come out from Ohio in 1868 with nothing but a wagon and a stubborn refusal to be beaten by the land. Ezekiel told her of his own family back in Missouri, of the brother whose horses he was chasing, of the long, slow years of learning to live with quiet where once there had been the sound of his wife singing and his daughter laughing. By the time they finally retired, Ezekiel to a bedroll near the fire and Jane to her narrow bed behind the curtain, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable, the way the first crack of light shifts the whole complexion of a dark room. Ezekiel woke before dawn, as was his habit, and found Jane already outside tending to the cattle, her breath fogging in the cool morning air, her rifle slung across her back out of long habit even in the relative safety of her own land. He watched her for a moment before making his presence known, struck again by the quiet competence of her, the way she moved among the animals with a confidence that spoke of years of hard-won skill. "You are up early," he said, coming to stand beside her at the fence. "I am up the same time I am always up," Jane said. "The cattle do not care what hour a person prefers to sleep until." "I imagine Holly's Beck will not have forgotten yesterday's humiliation," Ezekiel said. "A man like that, he will want to save face, especially in front of his own men." Jane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have dealt with Holly's Beck before. He has tried to run cattle off this land twice now, and twice I have run him off it. I do not expect a third time to be any different." "You should not have to keep dealing with him alone," Ezekiel said, and he watched the way her shoulders stiffened at the words, the old defensive posture of a woman who had learned that offers of help often came with hidden costs attached. "I have managed 8 years alone, Mr. Ashford," she said, an edge returning to her voice. "I imagine I can manage Holly's Beck." "I never said you could not manage him," Ezekiel replied, keeping his own voice level and calm. "I only said you should not have to. Those are different things, Jane." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the sound of it, spoken plain and unadorned in the cold morning air, seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him for a long moment, something working behind those coffee-dark eyes before she spoke again, quieter this time. "You said something yesterday," she said, "about not counting the years anymore. What did you mean by that?" Ezekiel considered his answer carefully before he gave it, sensing the importance of the moment even as he could not have said precisely why. "I meant that a person can spend so long counting how long they have suffered, how long they have carried something heavy, that the counting itself becomes its own kind of burden. You said you have carried this land alone since you were 19. That is not just a fact, Jane. That is a weight you have been adding to every single day for 8 years, whether you meant to or not. And I do not think you should have to keep tallying it up like debt in one of your ledgers." Jane was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the pale gold grass stretching toward the horizon, the cattle grazing peaceful and unaware of the conversation happening near them. "It is difficult to stop counting something you have counted for so long it has become part of how you understand yourself," she said finally. "I know," Ezekiel said. "I counted my own years too, after Sarah and Ruth passed. Counted every day I woke up without them, every season that turned without their voices in the house. It took me a long while to understand that counting was not honoring their memory. It was just drowning in it. And how did you stop? Jane asked, and there was something raw and searching in the question, something that told Ezekiel this conversation had moved beyond polite morning talk into territory that mattered. I am not certain I have stopped entirely, he admitted, but I have started trying. And I think meeting someone yesterday who reminded me that grief does not have to be a life sentence, that there can still be mornings worth waking up for, has helped more than I expected it to. Jane's cheeks colored slightly at that, though whether from the cold morning air or the plain honesty of his words, Ezekiel could not say for certain. You are a forward sort of man, Mr. Ashford, saying such things to a woman you met only yesterday. I have found that life is too short for excessive caution, Ezekiel said, particularly out here, where a man or woman never knows how many mornings they might have left to say the things worth saying. Before Jane could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew both their attention toward the eastern trail, and they turned to see a rider approaching at a hard gallop, dust kicking up behind him in a long trailing cloud. Jane's hand went immediately to her rifle, old instinct overriding any softer feelings the morning's conversation might have stirred. But as the rider drew closer, Ezekiel recognized the lathered horse and the young man's face beneath a battered hat. That is my nephew, Daniel, Ezekiel said, some tension easing from his shoulders even as new worry took its place. Something must be wrong for him to ride this hard. Daniel Ashford pulled his horse up short before them, breathing heavy, the animal beneath him flecked with sweat and foam. Uncle Ezekiel, he said, thank God I found you. Pa sent me. Holly's Beck's men, they hit our place last night, took another dozen horses and burned the north pasture fence besides. Pa is asking for you to come quick. Ezekiel's face darkened at the news, and Jane watched the change come over him, the way his earlier softness hardened into something more resolute, more purposeful. Holly's Beck again, he said, more to himself than to either of them. It seems the man has a talent for making enemies of us both, Jane. It seems he does, Jane agreed, and there was something in the shared look between them, a recognition of common cause that had not existed a day before. I must go to my brother, Ezekiel said. But Jane, I do not like the thought of leaving you here alone, not with Holly's Beck's temper still smarting from yesterday. I have managed alone before, Jane said, though the words carried less conviction than they might have the day before. I know you have, Ezekiel said, but you do not have to this time. Come with me to my brother's ranch. It is only a half-day's ride, and there is safety in numbers, especially against a man like Holly's Beck, who seems intent on causing trouble for every rancher within 50 miles. Jane hesitated, torn between the deep-ingrained habit of self-reliance and something newer, something that had begun to take root in her during the long conversation of the previous evening. My cattle, she said. I cannot simply leave them. I will send word to my hired man, Pete Larson, to come watch over them, Ezekiel said. He is trustworthy, and he owes me a favor from some years back. Your cattle will be safe, Jane, and so will you if you come with us. It was Daniel who spoke next, his young face earnest beneath the dust of his hard ride. Ma'am, if I may say so, my uncle speaks true. Holly's Beck is not a man to underestimate, and there is real danger in staying out here alone with him nursing a grudge. Jane looked between the two of them, uncle and nephew, and something in their combined concern, unfamiliar as it was to her after so many years of shouldering worry alone, finally broke through her resistance. Very well, she said. I will come, but only until this business with Holly's Beck is settled. I have no intention of abandoning my own land permanently, Mr. Ashford. I would not ask you to, Ezekiel said, and the relief in his voice was plain even to Jane's cautious ears. They rode out within the hour, Jane having sent word through a passing neighbor to Pete Larson about watching her cattle, her rifle secured across her back, and a small bag of essential belongings tied behind her saddle. The ride to the Ashford ranch took them across rolling prairie broken by occasional stands of cottonwood trees following the paths of dry creek beds, the Wyoming sky stretching vast and blue above them, unmarked by cloud. It was during this ride that Jane found herself, almost despite her own inclination toward caution, opening up to Ezekiel in ways she had not opened up to anyone in years. She told him of her father's death, the sudden failure of his heart during a spring branding that had left her, at 19, suddenly responsible for a ranch, and a debt she had not fully understood until the burden of it fell upon her shoulders. She told him of the lean years that followed, the winters where she had wondered if she and her small herd would survive until spring, the summer droughts that had tested every ounce of resourcefulness she possessed. "I married Thomas the year after my father passed," she said, as their horses moved at an easy walk across the open grassland. "Partly for love, I believe, though I have wondered since whether some part of it was also relief at the thought of not carrying everything alone. But he was never suited to ranch life, Mr. Ashford. He tried, God knows he tried, but the work wore on him in ways it did not wear on me. And when the fever took him 4 years back, I confess there was a part of me, shameful as it is to admit, that felt almost as though the burden had simply returned to where it had always truly been, on my own shoulders." "There is no shame in that," Ezekiel said. "Grief is rarely simple, and love does not erase the complicated truths beneath it. I loved Sarah dearly, and I grieved Ruth as any father would grieve a lost child. But there were nights after they passed when I felt something almost like relief that I no longer had to watch them suffer, and other nights when that same relief filled me with such guilt I could barely stand to look at myself in a mirror." Jane looked at him with something like gratitude for the honesty of it, the plain acknowledgement that grief was not the clean, simple thing that polite society often pretended it to be. "You understand more than most, Mr. Ashford. Please," he said, "call me Ezekiel. I think we have moved past the formality of surnames, given all we have shared in less than a full day's acquaintance." "Ezekiel, then," Jane said, and the name felt different in her mouth than it had the day before, warmer somehow, more familiar. They reached the Ashford ranch by early afternoon, and Jane found herself impressed by the scale of it. A larger spread than her own modest homestead, with a proper barn, a bunkhouse for hired hands, and a main house built of good timber that spoke of years of careful investment and hard labor. Ezekiel's brother, a broad-shouldered man named Caleb who bore a strong family resemblance to Ezekiel himself, met them in the yard with the weary, frustrated expression of a man who had spent the previous night dealing with theft and destruction. "Ezekiel," Caleb said, gripping his brother's hand firmly, "I am glad you came so quick. This business with Holly's Beck has gone on long enough. He has hit 3 ranches now in as many weeks, and the local sheriff seems disinclined to do much about it." "Sheriff Aldous Grimm has never been overly fond of confrontation," Ezekiel said, a hint of disgust in his voice. "But this cannot continue, Caleb. A man cannot simply steal and burn his way across the territory without consequence." Caleb's eyes turned toward Jane then, taking in her presence with evident curiosity. "And who might this be, brother? You did not mention traveling with company when Daniel found you." "This is Jane Conley," Ezekiel said. "She owns a ranch some 15 miles south of here. Holly's Beck attempted to steal her cattle yesterday, same as he has been stealing from half the ranches in this county." "Mrs. Conley," Caleb said, tipping his hat with evident respect, "I am sorry to hear you have suffered at that man's hands as well. It seems Holly's Beck has taken it upon himself to terrorize every honest rancher within riding distance." "I have dealt with him before," Jane said, "and I do not intend to let him run me off land I have worked 8 years to keep." "A woman of considerable spirit," Caleb said, glancing toward his brother with an expression that Jane could not quite read, but that made Ezekiel's ears redden slightly. "I can see why my brother thought to bring you along." They spent that evening in council around the Ashford family table, joined by 2 other ranchers from the surrounding area who had also suffered losses to Holly's Beck's gang. An older man named Silas Perkins, who had lost a dozen head of cattle the week before, and a younger rancher, recently married, named Thomas Whitfield. whose new barn had been burned to the ground not 10 days past. The conversation turned grim as the men discussed the growing pattern of theft and destruction, the apparent inability or unwillingness of the local law to intervene, and the mounting sense that the ranchers of this stretch of Wyoming territory would need to take matters into their own hands if they hoped to see Holly's Beck's reign of terror brought to an end. "We cannot simply wait for him to burn us all out one by one," Caleb said, striking the table with his palm for emphasis. "Something must be done, and done soon, before winter sets in and we are all left too weak from his thieving to survive the cold months." "I agree," Ezekiel said, "but we must be careful in how we proceed. Holly's Beck has, by my count, at least 8 men riding with him, and they are not above using violence when it suits their purposes. We cannot simply ride out and confront them without a plan, or we risk losing more than cattle and barns." It was Jane who spoke next, her voice cutting through the assembled men with the same steady confidence she had shown the day before, standing alone against Holly's Beck with nothing but her rifle and her nerve. "I know his patterns," she said. "He has tried to take from my land twice now, and both times he has approached from the western hills, using the cover of the rocky terrain there to mask his approach. If we know he is likely to try again, we might set a trap for him rather than waiting to be caught unaware." The men around the table looked at her with varying degrees of surprise, though Ezekiel found himself unsurprised by the sharpness of her thinking. He had already come to understand in the short time he had known her that Jane Conley possessed a mind as sharp as her aim with a rifle. "What do you propose, Mrs. Conley?" Silas Perkins asked, leaning forward with interest. "We know he does not forgive easily," Jane said. "Yesterday, when Ezekiel and I stood against him, he lost face in front of his own men. A man of his particular pride will not let that stand unanswered. I would wager he intends to return to my land within the week, likely at night, likely from the west. If we are prepared for him there, rather than waiting to be surprised at one ranch or another across the county, we might end this threat once and for all." "It is a sound plan," Ezekiel said, "though I do not like the thought of using your land as bait, Jane. It puts you at particular risk." "My land has already been at risk for 8 years," Jane said, meeting his eyes steadily across the table. "I would rather face that risk on my own terms, with allies at my side, than continue waiting for Holly's Beck to strike whenever and wherever he pleases." The plan was settled that night. The ranchers would gather at Jane's homestead over the following days, positioning themselves at strategic points along the western approach, waiting for Holly's Beck to make his expected return. It was a dangerous undertaking, but one born of necessity, and as the gathering broke up and each man retired to whatever rest he could find before the coming days of preparation, Ezekiel found himself seeking out Jane where she stood alone beneath the star-strewn sky outside the Ashford ranch house. "You are troubled," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I am always troubled before a fight," Jane admitted. "It does not get easier with practice, no matter what some might believe." "No," Ezekiel agreed, "I do not imagine it does, but you do not face this fight alone this time, Jane. That much at least has changed." She turned to look at him then, her expression softened by starlight and the accumulated weight of the day's revelations. "It has been strange," she said, "having someone stand beside me rather than simply relying on my own hands and my own wits. I had almost forgotten what it felt like." "Yes, I am glad to remind you," Ezekiel said, and there was something in his voice, low and warm, that made Jane's heart quicken in a way she had not expected and was not entirely certain she was prepared for. "Ezekiel," she said, his name still new and careful in her mouth, "I do not wish to presume anything about what has passed between us these past 2 days. We have known each other such a short while, and there is danger ahead that neither of us can predict the outcome of." "I do not presume anything either," Ezekiel said, "except that I have not felt this alive, this awake to the world around me, since before I lost Sarah and Ruth. I do not know what that means for certain, Jane, but I know I do not wish to pretend I have not felt it." Jane was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the dim starlight, searching for whatever certainty she needed before allowing herself to feel what her heart seemed determined to feel regardless of her permission. "Nor do I," she said finally, "wish to pretend." It was not a kiss that passed between them that night. Not yet. The moment too fragile and the circumstances too fraught with danger for either of them to fully surrender to what was building between their hearts. But it was an acknowledgement, quiet and honest beneath the vast Wyoming sky, that something had begun that neither of them intended to walk away from without seeing where it might lead. The days that followed were consumed with preparation. Ezekiel, Caleb, Silas Perkins, and Thomas Whitfield rode out to Jane's ranch, along with several hired hands from the Ashford spread, to establish positions along the western approach where Jane believed Holly's beck was most likely to strike. Pete Larson, the hired man who had been watching over Jane's cattle in her absence, proved a valuable addition to their number, familiar as he was with the terrain, and possessing a steady, reliable temperament that Ezekiel came to value greatly over the following days. Jane herself refused any suggestion that she remove herself from the confrontation entirely, insisting that this was her land, and she would defend it alongside the men who had come to her aid. Ezekiel, though worried for her safety, found he respected this insistence too much to argue against it with any real conviction, understanding by now that Jane Conley's strength was not something to be managed or contained, but something to be honored and stood beside. On the fourth night of their vigil, their patience was rewarded. Holly's beck and 7 of his men approached from the western hills exactly as Jane had predicted, moving under cover of a moonless sky toward the small herd of cattle grazing near the creek bed. But this time, they found not an unprotected widow standing alone, but a ring of armed ranchers positioned with careful precision around the very approach they had intended to use for their theft. The confrontation that followed was tense but, thanks to the careful planning and the sheer numbers arrayed against him, relatively brief. Holly's beck, finding himself outmaneuvered and outgunned, attempted to bluster his way through the situation as he had before, but this time his threats carried no weight against the combined resolve of the ranchers who had gathered against him. "You cannot hold 7 men prisoner forever," Holly's beck spat, his hands raised in reluctant surrender as Caleb Ashford and Thomas Whitfield secured his men's weapons. "We do not intend to," Ezekiel said, stepping forward with his own revolver leveled steady at the outlaw's chest. "We intend to see you and your men delivered to the sheriff in Cheyenne, where you can answer for the cattle you have stolen, the barns you have burned, and the fences you have destroyed across this county these past weeks. And should the sheriff prove as reluctant to act as he has in the past, I have already sent word to the territorial marshal, who I believe will take a considerably more serious view of your activities." It was a bluff, in part, though one grounded in genuine action Ezekiel had taken during the days of preparation, sending a letter by fast rider to the marshal's office requesting assistance with a growing pattern of theft and arson that the local sheriff had failed to adequately address. The bluff, combined with the very real defeat Holly's beck now faced at the hands of the assembled ranchers, proved sufficient to break whatever remaining resistance the outlaw might have offered. Jane, standing at the edge of the confrontation with her own rifle held steady, watched as Holly's beck and his men were disarmed and secured, watched as the threat that had haunted her ranch and the ranches of her neighbors for weeks was finally, decisively ended. There was a fierce satisfaction in the sight, but also, unexpectedly, tears that gathered at the corners of her eyes, born not of sorrow, but of the sheer relief of a burden finally, truly shared and overcome alongside others rather than carried alone. Ezekiel found her there some time later, after Holly's beck and his men had been secured, and preparations made to transport them to Cheyenne come morning, standing near the creek bed where the confrontation had unfolded, looking out at the cattle that had returned to peaceful grazing as though entirely unaware of the danger that had passed so near to them. "It is over," he said, coming to stand beside her. "It is over," Jane agreed, and there was wonder in her voice, as though she could hardly believe the truth of the words even as she spoke them. 8 years, Ezekiel, of facing every threat to this land alone, and it took less than a week with allies beside me to end the worst of them permanently. You were never truly meant to face it all alone, Ezekiel said. I do not believe anyone is meant to carry such weight by themselves, no matter how strong they might be. Jane turned to face him fully then, the moonlight catching the tears still gathered in her eyes, tears that had transformed from relief into something else entirely, as she looked at the man who had, in the span of less than a week, changed the entire trajectory of her carefully guarded, carefully solitary life. You said that first evening we spoke, she said, that I should not count the years anymore. I did not understand then what you meant, not fully, but I think I understand now. It was never truly about the counting, was it? It was about the belief that I had to be alone in order to be strong, that accepting help, accepting love, would somehow diminish everything I had built with my own hands. And do you still believe that? Ezekiel asked, his voice gentle, careful not to press her toward any conclusion she was not yet ready to reach on her own. No, Jane said, and the word carried the weight of genuine transformation, of a heart finally allowing itself to open after 8 long years of careful, protective closure. I do not believe that any longer, Ezekiel Ashford. I think perhaps I have been waiting, without fully realizing it, for someone to remind me that strength and love are not opposites, that I might carry this land and still allow someone to walk beside me while I do it. It was then that Ezekiel finally closed the distance between them, his hand rising to gently cup her cheek, tilting her face up toward his own with a tenderness that spoke of everything he had not yet found the words to say. I would very much like to walk beside you, Jane Conley, he said, for as long as you will have me. I believe, Jane said, her voice barely more than a whisper against the quiet night sounds of the prairie, that I would like that very much indeed. Their first kiss, when it finally came, was soft and searching, the culmination of days of careful conversation and shared danger and the slow, undeniable recognition that had grown between them since that first dust-choked afternoon when Ezekiel had ridden into her life as unexpectedly as a summer storm. It was not a kiss born of desperation or haste, but of two people who had each carried heavy losses through long years of solitude, finally allowing themselves the tentative hope that they might set some portion of that weight down together. They rode to Cheyenne the following morning, along with Caleb, Thomas Whitfield, and several of the other ranchers, delivering Hollis Beck and his men into the custody of the territorial marshal, who had indeed arrived in response to Ezekiel's letter, and who proved considerably more inclined toward decisive action than the local sheriff had been. Hollis Beck, faced with clear evidence of his crimes and testimony from multiple wronged ranchers, was bound over for trial, his gang scattered, and their brief reign of terror across the county brought to a definitive close. In the weeks that followed, Jane found herself dividing her time between her own ranch and increasingly frequent visits to the Ashford spread, where Ezekiel had taken to riding out to help with various tasks around her homestead, ostensibly in the name of neighborly assistance, but with an eagerness that neither of them attempted to disguise as merely practical in nature. Pete Larson, watching this courtship unfold with the amused patience of a man who had served Jane loyally through her hardest years, took to teasing her gently about the frequency of Ezekiel's visits, though Jane found she no longer minded such teasing the way she might have in earlier, more guarded years. "You are smiling again, Mrs. Conley," Pete observed one afternoon as they worked together mending fence along the northern edge of her property, "in a way I have not seen since before your husband passed." "Am I?" Jane asked, though the flush that colored her cheeks suggested she was well aware of the truth of his observation. "You are," Pete confirmed, "and I will say, it suits you far better than the worry lines I have grown accustomed to seeing there instead." It was during one such visit, some 3 weeks after Hollis Beck's capture, that Ezekiel arrived at Jane's ranch not with tools or supplies as had become his habit, but with a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the prairie and a nervousness in his manner that Jane found both endearing and slightly alarming, given how steady and composed she had come to know him to be. "Ezekiel," she said, accepting the flowers with evident pleasure, "what brings you here in such an unsettled state? Has something happened?" "Nothing has happened," Ezekiel said, though the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. "Or rather, nothing has happened yet, though I find myself hoping something might, if you are amenable to it." Jane set the flowers carefully on her kitchen table and turned to face him fully, sensing the importance of whatever he had come to say. "Whatever it is, Ezekiel, you may say it plainly. I have never had much patience for excessive delicacy." Ezekiel laughed, some of his nervousness easing at her characteristic directness. "No," he agreed, "I do not suppose you have." "Very well then, plainly. Jane Conley, these past weeks have been the happiest I have known since before I lost Sarah and Ruth, and I do not believe that happiness is coincidental to your presence in my life. I have come to love you, Jane, more deeply and more quickly than I would have thought possible given the short span of our acquaintance, and I find I do not wish to spend another day without telling you so plainly." Jane's breath caught at the directness of his declaration, though she should have expected nothing less from a man who had, from their very first meeting, spoken to her with a bluntness she had come to treasure. "Ezekiel," she said, "I have carried this land and the memory of my losses alone for so long that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to imagine a future that included someone else beside me. But these past weeks, watching you ride out to help with tasks that had nothing to do with your own ranch, watching you treat my strength as something to be admired rather than something to be threatened by, I have come to understand that I love you as well. More deeply than I expected to be capable of loving anyone again." "Then," Ezekiel said, moving closer to take her hands in his own, "might I ask you something further, Jane, something that would bind our futures together in a manner more permanent than mere courtship?" Jane's heart quickened, understanding what he intended to ask even before he found the words to voice it. "You may ask," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "Jane Conley," Ezekiel said, kneeling before her there in the small kitchen of her ranch house, the wildflowers he had brought sitting fragrant on the table beside them, "would you consent to become my wife? I do not offer you rescue, for I know well by now that you require no rescuing. I offer instead partnership and love, and the promise that you will never again have to count the years you carry any burden alone, for I intend to carry them alongside you for whatever years we are blessed to share together." Tears gathered in Jane's eyes, tears of a joy so profound she had almost forgotten such feeling was possible after 8 long years of careful, guarded solitude. "Yes," she said, "yes, Ezekiel Ashford, I will marry you, and gladly, and I thank God for the day Holly's Beck's thieving brought you riding into my life." Their wedding took place some 6 weeks later in early autumn, when the prairie grass had begun to turn gold, and the air carried the first cool promise of the coming winter. It was a modest ceremony, held at the Ashford Ranch with a circuit preacher who traveled through the territory only a few times each year, but the modesty of the occasion did nothing to diminish the joy that filled every heart present. Caleb Ashford stood as his brother's witness, beaming with evident happiness at the transformation he had watched unfold in Ezekiel over the preceding months. Pete Larson gave Jane away, in the absence of any living family of her own, his weathered face wet with tears he made no effort to hide as he placed her hand in Ezekiel's before the assembled witnesses. "I have watched this woman carry burdens that would have broken lesser souls," Pete said, in the brief words he offered before stepping back to allow the ceremony to proceed, "and I have never seen her happier than these past weeks, since Mr. Ashford rode into her life. I could not be more pleased to see her finally allowed the rest she has long deserved." The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Josiah Kemp, who had traveled through much of the Wyoming territory over his years of service, spoke words that seemed particularly suited to the two people standing before him, having heard something of their story from Caleb during his brief stay at the ranch. "Marriage," Reverend Kemp said, "is not the erasure of the person you were before you found each other, but the joining of two complete souls who choose, freely and with full understanding of what such a choice requires, to carry their futures together rather than apart." Jane Conley has shown this territory what strength and resilience look like, carried alone through years that would have tested any soul. Ezekiel Ashford has shown what patience and gentle recognition can accomplish, seeing not weakness in a woman's solitary strength, but a fullness worthy of partnership rather than rescue. May this union be blessed with the same resilience that has carried each of you through your separate trials, now combined and multiplied through the grace of shared purpose. When the vows were exchanged and the ceremony concluded, Ezekiel kissed his new wife before the assembled gathering of neighbors and friends, a kiss that carried within it all the hope and healing that had grown between them since that first dust-choked afternoon when their paths had crossed by what could only be described as providence. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with food prepared by the neighboring ranch wives, music provided by a fiddle player from a nearby settlement, and dancing that continued under lantern light long after the sun had set behind the western hills. Jane found herself, at one point during the festivities, standing slightly apart from the gathering, watching the joy and celebration surrounding her with an expression of quiet wonder. "You look as though you cannot quite believe this is real," Ezekiel said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over their months of courtship. "I do not quite believe it," Jane admitted. "For so long, I imagined my life would continue exactly as it had been. Alone, careful, counting every hardship as though each one confirmed some truth about what I deserved or did not deserve. I did not imagine there could be this much joy waiting for me, if only I allowed myself to stop counting and simply live." "Then let us simply live," Ezekiel said, "together, for whatever years we are blessed to share, and let us make certain that neither of us ever has occasion to count loneliness among our burdens again." They settled, following their marriage, at Jane's original homestead, which Ezekiel had come to love nearly as much as she did during his months of courtship, though they also maintained close ties to the Ashford Ranch, where Caleb continued to work alongside them during branding season and harvest, the two properties functioning almost as a single extended family enterprise that benefited from the combined strength and resources of both households. The following spring brought news that further cemented the sense of new beginning that had settled over their shared life. Jane discovered she was carrying a child, a discovery that filled both her and Ezekiel with a joy tempered only slightly by the memory of losses each had suffered in years past. Ezekiel, remembering the daughter he had lost to fever years before, found himself alternating between profound happiness and a protective anxiety that Jane, with characteristic directness, addressed head-on one evening as they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over land that now felt, for the first time in either of their lives, entirely and completely shared. "You are afraid," Jane observed, not unkindly, watching the shadow that crossed her husband's face whenever thoughts of Ruth surfaced in connection with their coming child. "I am," Ezekiel admitted. "I do not wish to burden you with fears that are mine alone to carry, but I confess the thought of loving a child again after losing Ruth brings with it a terror I had not fully anticipated." "We will not pretend the fear does not exist," Jane said, taking his hand in her own, "but neither will we allow it to steal the joy this child deserves from both of us. We have each learned this past year that carrying fear alone only magnifies its power. Let us carry this fear together, Ezekiel, same as we have carried everything else since that first day you rode into my life." Their son, whom they named Nathaniel after Ezekiel's own father, was born in the depths of winter, during a storm severe enough that Ezekiel had feared for a time they would not reach the small settlement where a midwife could assist, though in the end Jane's own strength and the assistance of a neighboring rancher's wife proved sufficient to see the birth through safely. Nathaniel arrived healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair that matched his mother's own, and Ezekiel wept openly upon holding his son for the first time, tears that mingled joy for the child now in his arms with grief for the daughter he had lost years before, both emotions held together in a manner that no longer felt like betrayal of one by the other, but rather like the full, complicated truth of a heart capable of loving deeply despite, or perhaps because of, the losses it had survived. "He is beautiful," Jane said, watching her husband hold their newborn son with a tenderness that never failed to move her, even months into their marriage. "Ruth would be glad, I think, to know her father found room in his heart for another child to love." "I believe you are right," Ezekiel said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I believe Thomas would be glad as well, to know that you found happiness again after everything you carried alone." 2 years after Nathaniel's birth, Jane gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Sarah in honor of Ezekiel's first wife, a decision that Jane herself had proposed, understanding by now the full measure of grief and love that had shaped the man she had married, and wishing to honor rather than erase the losses that had brought him to her in the first place. Little Sarah proved to have her father's steady temperament combined with her mother's fierce independence, a combination that promised, even in infancy, to produce a young woman as formidable as her namesake and her mother both. The ranch itself flourished under their combined stewardship, the herds growing steadily larger with each passing year, the debt that had once burdened Jane's father, and subsequently Jane herself, finally paid off entirely by the 5th year of their marriage. Ezekiel proved as skilled at ranch work as he was at the gentler arts of courtship and partnership, and the two of them together built something that neither could have constructed alone. Not merely a successful ranch, but a home filled with the kind of steady, resilient love that had grown from the ashes of shared grief into something entirely new and entirely their own. Hollis Beck, for his part, was tried and convicted in Cheyenne for his crimes against the ranchers of the county, sentenced to a lengthy term in the territorial prison that ensured he would trouble Jane's land, or anyone else's, for many years to come. The confrontation that had brought Jane and Ezekiel together thus found its own resolution, a chapter closed even as the larger story of their shared life continued to unfold with each passing season. It was during the celebration of their 5th wedding anniversary, held at the same ranch house where they had exchanged their vows years before, that Jane found herself once again standing slightly apart from the gathered celebration, watching her husband play with their 2 children in the golden light of the late afternoon, Nathaniel now old enough to ride a small pony with his father's careful guidance, Sarah toddling determinedly across the yard, with the same fierce independence that had characterized her mother from her earliest days. Caleb Ashford, now himself married to a young woman named Rebecca who had moved to the territory some 2 years prior, came to stand beside Jane as she watched the scene unfold before her. "You have built something remarkable here, Jane," Caleb said. "Both of you. I confess I did not expect, that first day my brother rode off chasing stolen horses, that he would return not merely with information about the theft but with a wife, and eventually the beginning of an entirely new family." "Nor did I expect it," Jane admitted, smiling at the memory of that first dust-choked afternoon, so different from the peaceful golden scene before her now. "I had convinced myself in the years after Thomas passed that solitude was simply the price of survival in this territory. I did not understand until Ezekiel showed me otherwise, that survival and solitude were not in fact synonymous. He has told me," Caleb said, "of the words he spoke to you that first day about not counting the years any longer. I believe those words changed something fundamental in how you understood your own life." "They did," Jane agreed. "I had spent 8 years counting every hardship, every loss, every burden I carried alone, as though the counting itself gave meaning to my suffering. Ezekiel taught me, without perhaps fully intending to at first, that meaning comes not from counting our burdens but from choosing, again and again, to carry them alongside those we love, and to allow ourselves to be carried in turn when the weight grows too heavy for our own strength alone. As the sun continued its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that Jane had come to associate with some of the most meaningful moments of her life, Ezekiel looked up from where he knelt beside Nathaniel's pony and caught his wife's eye across the yard. The look that passed between them, even after 5 years of marriage, still carried the same electric recognition that had first sparked between them during that fateful confrontation with Holly's Beck, a recognition that had only deepened and strengthened through years of shared partnership, shared parenthood, and shared commitment to a love that neither of them had expected to find, but that both had come to consider the truest blessing of their respective lives. He rose and walked toward her, leaving Nathaniel to continue his careful practice atop the pony under the watchful eye of Pete Larson, who had remained a steady and beloved presence on their ranch through all the years of their marriage, having become something like a beloved uncle to their growing children. "You are thinking deeply about something," Ezekiel observed, coming to stand beside his wife, his arm settling naturally around her waist in the manner that had become as familiar and comfortable as breathing itself over their years together. "I am thinking about that first day," Jane said, "when you rode up while I stood facing down Holly's Beck, and how little I understood then about how completely my life was about to change." "Do you regret any part of it?" Ezekiel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, seeking confirmation rather than genuine information. "Not a single moment," Jane said, turning to face him fully, her hand rising to rest against his chest where she could feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. "Though I confess, I sometimes marvel at how close I came to sending you away that very first evening. So determined was I to prove that I needed no one's help, that 8 years of solitary strength had made me impervious to the possibility of partnership." "I am glad you did not send me away," Ezekiel said, his voice warm with the particular tenderness he reserved only for her, even after years of marriage and the accumulated familiarity that might have dulled such tenderness in lesser unions. "So am I," Jane said, and rose on her toes to press a kiss against his lips, brief but heartfelt. A small public display that would have scandalized her years ago, but that now felt as natural and necessary as the air she breathed. Their daughter Sarah, having toddled her way across the yard during this exchange, tugged insistently at her mother's skirts, demanding attention with the particular impatience of a 2-year-old unwilling to be ignored for even a moment longer than necessary. Jane laughed and scooped her daughter into her arms, settling the child against her hip with the easy competence of long practice. "You have your father's patience for waiting your turn," Jane told her daughter, though the words were delivered with obvious affection rather than any genuine complaint. "And her mother's determination to be heard regardless," Ezekiel added, reaching out to smooth a wisp of dark hair back from his daughter's forehead with a gentleness that spoke of the deep, unwavering love he held for both his children. As evening settled fully over the ranch, the celebration continuing with music and dancing much as their wedding celebration had years before, Ezekiel found himself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought him to this particular moment of contentment. He had come west following Sarah and Ruth's death seeking, if not exactly to outrun grief, then at least to find some new purpose that might make the burden of continued living bearable. He had not expected, in chasing stolen horses across the Wyoming prairie, to find instead a woman whose own losses and whose own strength would call forth from him a capacity for love and partnership he had feared permanently extinguished by his earlier tragedy. Jane, for her part, found herself equally reflective as she watched her husband dance with their son, held carefully in his arms. Nathaniel's delighted laughter carrying across the yard, as Ezekiel spun him gently in time with the fiddle music. She had spent 8 long years believing that strength required solitude, that accepting help or accepting love would somehow diminish the hard-won competence she had developed through years of necessary self-reliance. Ezekiel had shown her, through patient partnership rather than any attempt to rescue or diminish her independence, that the truest strength lay not in solitary endurance, but in the courage to remain open to love even after profound loss, to allow oneself to be supported even while remaining fundamentally capable of standing alone if circumstances demanded it. The years that followed their 5th anniversary brought their own share of challenges, as any life lived on the unforgiving frontier inevitably must. A drought in their 8th year of marriage tested their resources and their resolve, requiring careful management of their herds and difficult decisions about which animals to sell off early rather than risk losing them entirely to the dry conditions. A particularly harsh winter some years later brought illness to their household, with both children suffering through a difficult fever that kept Jane and Ezekiel awake through anxious nights, tending to their care with the same combined strength and mutual support that had characterized their partnership from its earliest days. But through each challenge, the foundation they had built together, that fundamental understanding that burdens shared were burdens lightened rather than diminished, carried them through with a resilience that surprised even themselves at times. Where Jane might once have faced such trials alone, convinced that solitary endurance was the only path available to her, she now found strength in partnership, in the knowledge that whatever difficulty arose, she would face it alongside a husband who had proven, time and again, his commitment to standing beside her rather than simply attempting to shield her from hardship altogether. By the time their 10th anniversary arrived, Jane and Ezekiel had built a ranch that stood among the most successful in the county, their herds having grown substantially through careful management, and the combined labor of a family that now included not only Nathaniel and Sarah, but also a younger son, born in their 7th year of marriage and named Caleb after Ezekiel's own beloved brother, who had stood beside them through so much of their shared journey. The ranch house itself had grown as well, expanded from the modest structure Jane had inherited from her father into a larger, more comfortable home that could accommodate their growing family, while still retaining the essential character of the original homestead that had witnessed both Jane's years of solitary struggle and the beginning of her transformed life alongside Ezekiel. It was on the occasion of this 10th anniversary that Jane found herself once again reflecting on the words that had first drawn her attention toward the man who would become her husband, that assertion he had made during their very first meaningful conversation, that she should not count the years she had carried her burdens alone. Standing now in the doorway of the home they had built together, watching her 3 children play in the yard under a sky painted with the same brilliant colors that had accompanied so many meaningful moments of her life these past 10 years, she understood finally and completely what those words had meant, and what gift they had ultimately given her. "You are smiling again," Ezekiel said, coming to stand beside her in the doorway, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a decade's shared partnership. "I am thinking," Jane said, "about how strange it is that I once believed counting my solitary years was a form of strength, when really it was simply a way of measuring my own isolation. You taught me to stop counting, Ezekiel, and in doing so, you taught me that love was not weakness, that partnership was not surrender, that the truest strength lies in allowing yourself to be known and supported by someone who sees your full worth. I did not teach you anything you did not already possess within yourself," Ezekiel said, his voice thick with the particular emotion that 10 years of marriage had done nothing to diminish. "I merely had the good fortune to arrive at a moment when you were ready to recognize it. Perhaps," Jane said, "though I believe some credit is due to the man brave enough to stand beside a woman with a rifle in her hands and offer partnership rather than simply admiration from a safe distance." Ezekiel laughed, the sound carrying warmly across the yard where their children continued their play, oblivious to the significant conversation unfolding between their parents. "I believe I fell in love with that particular image of you, Jane Conley Ashford, before I fully understood what falling in love even meant. There was something about the sight of you standing so fiercely against Holly's beck that told me, even before I had spoken a single word to you, that here was a woman worth knowing, worth loving, worth building an entire life alongside." "And I am glad," Jane said, "more glad than words can properly express, that you decided to act on that recognition rather than simply riding on toward your brother's stolen horses and leaving me to face Holly's beck alone." "As am I," Ezekiel said, and pulled her close for a kiss that carried within it all the accumulated tenderness and passion of 10 years of shared life, 10 years of raising children together, of building a home together, of facing every hardship the unforgiving frontier could offer with a combined strength that had proven, time and again, more than sufficient to whatever challenge arose. Their children, noticing their parents' embrace, called out with the particular embarrassment that children reserve for witnessing parental affection, prompting laughter from both Jane and Ezekiel as they broke apart to attend to the demands of family life that continued regardless of whatever tender moments passed between husband and wife. That evening, as the family gathered around their table for supper, Nathaniel, now 12 years old and possessed of a curiosity that had only grown more pronounced with each passing year, asked the question that had apparently been forming in his young mind for some time. "Mother," he said, "Uncle Caleb told me once that you used to run this whole ranch by yourself before you married Father. Is that true?" Jane exchanged a glance with Ezekiel across the table, seeing in his eyes the same warmth and pride that filled her own heart at the question. "It is true," she said. "I ran this ranch alone for 8 years, from the time I was 19 years old until I was 27, when your father rode into my life quite unexpectedly. Was it very difficult?" Nathaniel asked, with the particular directness of childhood that had not yet learned the social delicacies adults often employed around difficult topics. "It was very difficult," Jane confirmed. "There were winters I was not certain we would survive, droughts that tested every resource I possessed, and threats from dishonest men who believed a woman alone could be easily taken advantage of. I learned during those years to be strong, to be resourceful, to never give up even when circumstances seemed most dire." "But you do not carry the ranch alone anymore," young Sarah observed, with the particular wisdom that sometimes emerges unexpectedly from children still young enough to see truths that adults have complicated through excessive analysis. "No," Jane said, smiling at her daughter's simple but profound observation. "I do not carry it alone anymore, and I have not for many years now. Your father taught me something important when we first met. That strength is not diminished by love. That partnership does not erase the hard-won competence a person develops through difficult years, but rather adds to it, multiplies it, makes it possible to build something even greater than what either person could achieve alone." "I am glad you are not alone anymore, Mother," young Caleb said, the youngest of their 3 children, still small enough to require occasional assistance reaching items on the table, but old enough to understand, in his own simple way, the importance of what his mother had just described. "So am I," Jane said, reaching out to gently touch her youngest son's cheek with obvious affection. "So am I, my darling boy." As the meal continued and the conversation turned to lighter topics, questions about the following day's planned activities and reports on the various small dramas that occupied the attention of children growing up on a working ranch, Ezekiel found himself watching his family with a contentment so profound it occasionally still surprised him, even after 10 years of marriage. He had come west believing his capacity for happiness had been permanently diminished by the loss of Sarah and Ruth. He had not expected to find, in the dust and danger of a confrontation with a cattle rustler, the beginning of a love that would prove not merely a replacement for what he had lost, but an entirely new and complete happiness in its own right, one that honored his past losses while building something genuinely new upon their foundation. Later that night, after the children had been settled into their beds and the ranch house had grown quiet with the particular peace that settles over a home at the end of a full and satisfying day, Jane and Ezekiel sat together on their porch, watching the same star-strewn sky that had witnessed the beginning of their courtship a decade before. 10 years, Jane said softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. I find it difficult to believe so much time has passed since that first evening you sat across my table and told me I should stop counting the years I had carried this land alone. And have you stopped counting? Ezekiel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer, having watched the transformation in his wife over their years together with the particular attention of a man deeply in love. I have stopped counting the burdens, Jane said, though I confess I have taken up a new kind of counting these past 10 years, counting our children's laughter, counting the seasons we have weathered together, counting the countless small moments of joy that have accumulated into what I can only describe as the fullest and happiest life I ever imagined possible for myself. That, Ezekiel said, drawing her close against his side as they continued to watch the stars, is precisely the kind of counting I would encourage, Jane Conley Ashford. Counting joy rather than counting burden, counting blessing rather than counting solitary struggle. You have given me so much to count, Jane said, her voice thick with emotion despite the years that had passed since their first meeting, the depth of her love for this man having only grown stronger and more certain with each passing season of their shared life. I do not know how I would have found this happiness without you, Ezekiel. I do not know what my life would have become had you simply ridden past that day, continuing on toward your brother's stolen horses without stopping to intervene in my confrontation with Holly's beck. I have wondered the same, Ezekiel admitted. What might have become of me had I not stopped that day? I believe I would have continued my search for the stolen horses, eventually found some resolution to that particular problem, and returned to my own solitary existence, still grieving Sarah and Ruth, still uncertain whether happiness of the kind I now possess was even available to a man who had suffered such profound loss. I am grateful every single day, Jane said. That fate, or providence, or simple coincidence brought you riding across that particular stretch of prairie at that particular moment, when I most needed both the physical assistance you provided against Holly's beck and the emotional recognition that I did not have to carry every burden of my life entirely alone. They sat together for a long while longer, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, each lost in their own contemplation of the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment of deep, settled contentment. The ranch that Jane had once carried alone through 8 difficult years now flourished under their combined stewardship, home to 3 children who would grow up understanding, through their parents' example, that true strength lay not in solitary endurance, but in the courage to remain open to love, to partnership, to the possibility that life's heaviest burdens become lighter when shared with someone who sees your full worth and chooses, freely and completely, to stand beside you through whatever challenges the future might bring. Eventually, as the night grew late and the practical demands of ranch life reminded them both that morning would arrive early regardless of how long they lingered beneath the stars, Jane and Ezekiel rose together and made their way inside, pausing briefly at the doorway of their home to share one final, tender kiss before retiring for the night. I love you, Jane Conley Ashford, Ezekiel said, using her full married name as he sometimes did in moments of particular tenderness. More today than I did 10 years ago, though I would not have believed such deepening of love possible on that first evening we spoke across your kitchen table. And I love you, Ezekiel Ashford, Jane replied, more than I have words to properly express, and more grateful than I can adequately convey for the day you rode into my life and taught me that some burdens are not meant to be counted alone, but shared, and in the sharing, transformed into something far more precious than solitary endurance could ever provide. They retired that night as they had retired countless nights before, together, their hands clasped even in sleep, their hearts fully and completely joined in a partnership that had begun with a chance encounter during a dangerous confrontation, and had grown, over 10 years of shared life, into a love story that stood as testament to the particular resilience and capacity for renewal that characterized the finest of frontier hearts. In the years that followed, Jane and Ezekiel continued to build their life together on the Wyoming ranch that had once belonged solely to Jane's father, then to Jane alone, and now belonged to both of them equally, a testament to partnership that honored rather than erased the individual strength each had brought to their union. Their children grew, in time, into adults of their own, Nathaniel eventually taking over management of much of the ranch's daily operations, Sarah marrying a young rancher from a neighboring property, and starting her own family while remaining close enough to visit her parents regularly, and young Caleb pursuing an education in Cheyenne, before returning to help manage the family's growing agricultural interests. Jane never did resume counting the years, not in the way she once had, marking each season as another burden survived alone. Instead, she counted blessings, counted the accumulated joy of a marriage that had exceeded every hope she had once believed impossible for a woman who had convinced herself that solitary strength was the only path available to her. She counted grandchildren, eventually, as Sarah and later Nathaniel began families of their own, each new arrival celebrated with the particular joy of a woman who understood, more deeply than most, how precious the gift of shared love truly was. Ezekiel, for his part, found in his marriage to Jane, and in the family they built together, a healing he had not believed possible in the aftermath of Sarah and Ruth's deaths. He carried their memory always, honoring it not through continued grief, but through the love and care he showed his living family, understanding that his capacity to love Jane and their children did not diminish or replace his love for those he had lost, but rather stood as testament to the particular resilience of a heart capable of surviving profound loss and still opening itself fully to new possibilities for joy. They grew old together on that Wyoming ranch, weathering additional hardships as the years progressed, including a severe blizzard in their 20th year of marriage that tested their resources and required the full measure of resilience they had each developed through their respective earlier trials, and a period of economic difficulty in the early 1890s when cattle prices dropped precipitously across the territory, requiring careful management and difficult decisions to see their ranch through the challenging period without significant loss. But through each challenge, their partnership held firm, strengthened rather than diminished by the accumulated years of shared struggle and shared triumph. They had learned, each in their own way, that love was not the erasure of individual strength, but its multiplication. That partnership did not diminish the hard-won competence each had developed through earlier solitary years, but rather provided a foundation from which that competence could grow into something even more remarkable. On the occasion of their 25th wedding anniversary, celebrated with a gathering that included not only their own children and grandchildren, but also Caleb Ashford's now-grown family and Pete Larson, still spry despite his advancing years, and still considered something like beloved family by all who knew him, Jane found herself once again reflecting on the words that had first drawn her toward the man who had become the center of her life. "You told me, that first evening we spoke," she said to Ezekiel, as they stood together watching their grandchildren play in the same yard where their own children had once played, that I should stop counting the years I had carried this land alone. I did not understand then how completely that simple statement would transform my entire life. I did not fully understand it myself, Ezekiel admitted, his hair now touched with gray, but his eyes still holding the same warmth and steady devotion they had carried since their earliest days together. I only knew, watching you stand against Holly's beck with such fierce determination, that here was a woman who deserved not to carry such burdens alone, and that I very much wanted to be the one to stand beside her, if she would permit it. I permitted it, Jane said, smiling at the memory of her own initial resistance, her fierce insistence that she required no rescue, no assistance, no partnership. Though I confess I nearly did not, so convinced was I that accepting help would somehow diminish the strength I had worked so hard to develop. And has it diminished your strength? Ezekiel asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical, both of them understanding by now the true answer that 25 years of shared life had provided beyond any doubt. It has multiplied it, Jane said, beyond anything I could have imagined possible on that dust-choked afternoon when you first rode into my life. I am stronger now, Ezekiel, not despite our partnership but because of it. I have raised 3 children who understand that love and strength are not opposites. I have built a ranch that thrives not through solitary endurance but through combined effort and mutual support. I have lived a life richer and more meaningful than I ever believed possible during those 8 lonely years before you arrived. Ezekiel drew his wife close, there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the family they had built together, the ranch that had grown and flourished under their combined stewardship, the accumulated evidence of 25 years of a love that had begun with an unexpected act of protection against a cattle rustler, and had grown, through patient partnership and unwavering commitment, into one of the great enduring romances of the Wyoming frontier. I love you, Jane, he said, simply and completely, the words carrying the full weight of 25 years of shared devotion. I love you too, Ezekiel, Jane replied, more than I have ever had words to properly express, and grateful beyond measure that you rode into my life and taught me that some things are not meant to be counted alone, but rather shared, treasured, and multiplied through the simple, profound gift of a love freely given and freely received. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the Wyoming sky in the same brilliant colors that had witnessed so many significant moments of their shared life together, Jane Conley Ashford and Ezekiel Ashford stood together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by friends who had become family, by a ranch that stood as testament to what patient partnership and unwavering love could accomplish even in the face of the frontier's harshest challenges. Their story, which had begun with 8 lonely years of solitary struggle and had transformed, through an unexpected meeting and a growing recognition of shared purpose, into a love story spanning decades, stood complete in its happiness, resolved in every particular that mattered, a testament to the truth that even the deepest burdens, carried long enough alone, might yet find their proper resolution in the arms of someone willing to help carry them forward together, for all the years still to come.